one, should we increase defence spending anyway because the US is going isolationist? And two, what would be enough for a country with such a huge landmass and a small population?
Well, I think what Secretary Hegseth said is actually not irreconcilable with what the government itself wants out of its defence policy. The government is spending more money on defence. It is spending record levels on defence at the moment. But we've had a long national conversation happening here in Australia well before President Trump was re-elected late last year on whether the levels of defence spending were correct. The Prime Minister in his comments was very clear that the way to do defence spending is actually to figure out what your risks are and what you want to spend your money on, and then developing the budget portfolio to do that. But I think there's a general consensus amongst the strategic policy community in Australia that while the government's doing a good job to lift defence spending, it's not spending enough money. The government does talk about this being the most difficult strategic circumstances since the end of the Second World War, and Australia's defence spending will increase, but only modestly as a percentage of GDP. And in fact, modestly as a percentage of government spending. Australia spends about 6.5% of its budget on defence. If you contrast that back to the Hawke government, for instance, we were spending around 3% of GDP on defence, about 10% of the budget on defence, in an era that was actually much more stable than the era is today. And of course, Australia's foundation is about building more self-reliance within the framework of the US alliance. And that's basically what Secretary Hegseth is pushing for here as well. It's a matter of how much is the right amount of money to achieve strategic objectives. But there is a consensus, I said, in the Australian strategic policy community before Trump was elected that we do need to spend more money on defence. And probably around a kind of a 3% mark has been a figure that has been used as a shorthand for a rough guide. That's an extra $21 billion a year on defence to fill out not just the AUKUS program, but the range of initiatives that the government has in its national defence strategy.
And isn't there disagreement about what we should be spending it on?
Look, that's always a contest and a debate. I think the government's spending record levels, as it said, but a lot of that money is being eaten up by inflation and the cost of doing business. Defence budgets, like household budgets, are impacted by the cost of living and inflation rises. A lot of the additional money that the government is being provided to the Department of Defence is being absorbed in those measures, which is not leaving a lot left for enhanced capability or, basic issues such as sustainment. Then you add on top the AUKUS submarine program. That's a very important, in fact, a critical program, but also a very expensive one. And then if you really want to get to other things such as long-range strike, guided weapons production, integrated air and missile defence, enhancing cyber capabilities and space capabilities, most experts believe there has to be a further injection of money into defence. And while the government, as the Prime Minister outlined, is spending a significant amount more, the real lift in the defence spending budget envelope comes in the second half of the decade. That's another election or two away from where we are today. And given the risks that we face, and as Secretary Hegseth said at Shangri-La, the more imminent risks in our theatre, I think there is a need to spend more money in defence over the forward estimates.
Do you think the, arms race in the region will actually lead to more aggression by China as a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Well, that's what some commentators would argue. But I would say if there's an arms race happening in the Indo-Pacific, it's really only happening by one country, and that is China. And the rest of us are all attempting to try and just catch up or keep up with some measure of increased capability to offset the massive expansion of Chinese military capabilities. I mean, China is undertaking, for instance, the largest expansions of the nuclear weapons program of any state since the early Cold War. They're also undertaking one of the largest uplifts of conventional forces. And we know now that by ship count, the Chinese Navy is the largest Navy in the world. They're also offsetting this by increasingly aggressive behaviour in the East and South China Sea, increasing coercion of Taiwan, and rhetoric coming out of the Chinese leadership that they're willing to support their political goals through the use of coercion or military force. And of course, we can see the deep support that China is providing Russia in its illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. So this is creating that very environment of instability and uncertainty. I think what you're seeing from Japan, Korea, Australia, the Philippines and others is a very measured response to some very provocative actions on the behalf of China. And if you compare the raises in defence spending from those states compared to China, they pale in comparison. So, as I said, there's really one state pushing an arms race in that region, and that's China, and it's the rest of us trying to have sensible and prudent measures to offset rising Chinese aggression and capability.
Thank you so much for your time. Next time I'll have to ask you about multilateral defence. Professor Peter Dean, Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the University of Sydney's United States Study Centre.